Well, we've had 4 extremely interesting papers, and I think lots of... one thing I think that's come up is, in all 4 actually, has been, in a sense, the importance of collectors, early collectors, in the generation, really, of the taste for medieval, Renaissance, Majolica and so forth. I was particularly interested in, Christina, your comments about the importance of the excavations of Ecouen in 1830. Perhaps, do you know how those excavations were publicized or became known to the broader world?
I'm sorry, the excavations about?
At Ecouen, of the Tuileries, the palace. The point was that these were somehow a kind of starting point, a kind of catalyst for interest in Palissy overall.
Oh, I think that for a long time there were campaigns. I'm sorry, because I'm some difficult with the English.
Oh,
I forget it.
Don't worry.
And it was found that fragments of the grotto, because for a long time the people, church is that church, and they found that fragments, and I think it was astonishing to the world. And Aviso, it was the first to know it, and a lot of ceramists that imitated him, and it was a style very that people love it very much. And it arriving at Portugal, it's strange, but I think it is connected with the fact that Caldas was always an environment artistically very rich with the royal family.
Yeah.
And they bring the news and the books and everything.
It's extraordinary he never left Portugal. Indeed.
Yes.
But it just seems that the Soulage collection clearly was important, but there, I mean, in the Majolica literature, somehow it's taken for granted that the potters drew inspiration from these collections, and I don't personally know enough about the formation of those collections and when they started and how they started and so forth. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that aspect of early interest, I suppose.
Well, I think certainly with the private collections, before they, if they do reach museum collections, certainly they're on display, but also at many of the exhibitions alongside were exhibits of historical collections, personal private collections in Paris, for example, and then illustrated by permission of the private collectors. And certainly you see examples of illustrations then being used by the manufacturers of the day. So I think there are a number of different ways that the information about these private collections was disseminated. And I also mentioned that Leonard Nou had taken photographs of collections, and those, of course, were shared with Henry Cole and Herbert Minton as well. So I think there were a number of ways that these collections were proudly displayed, because it was a great feat, and certainly by the mid-19th century they were becoming ever more rare. So to have the original pieces was a feat, yeah.
And we also have to remember that this was the age of catalog production.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
you find in some of the archives catalogs of all the other manufacturers, which are, a gift when you find them.
For sure. But it's interesting that one wonders whether this urge to collect was also generated by the antiquarian interest. You mentioned Isana Diderot and Rome in the 18th century. So clearly there is this tradition from which the collecting actually sprang.
It's definitely an intellectual pursuit and part of being in a certain level of society, and it comes out of a gentlemanly tradition.
Yeah. Interesting. The floor is open. Yes.
Could I be wrong in saying that Minton seemed to, as one of the great influences, was it Minton because of what they were doing at these exhibitions? Was it their thing of bringing it more to the common home, the regular home, by copying pieces that were in great collections and copying pieces of princes in different collections? Was it their goal to bring this to the more regular, I don't know what phrase to use, of regular people?
Well, certainly the price point on Majolica was much lower, as I showed you, with the cost of the soulage ewer was £200 individually, and I can't remember so many pounds and shillings for the Majolica version. But I think they had different audiences. They were looking with the showstopper pieces. They were aiming for the great collectors, but also museum collections. They did tablewares, and we do have some examples in the museum collection, but also this was a time when they have their own reference collection, their own museum collection. They're travelling and buying pieces as far as Istanbul, Turkey, Iznik, and so they're interested in referencing these collections as a source of design ideas, and the novelty, but also the reference for historical collectors certainly is there. I think also it touches on with the Italian production of whether it was good enough to have these reproductions or the original. And I think when pieces are clearly marked, they are new, they are novel, people are not necessarily ashamed to have a Minton version. In fact, they're very proud to have a Minton version.
Minton was always the top of the
Yeah.
line. It was always the most expensive,
Yeah.
and most people could not afford it unless
Yeah.
you were quite wealthy at the
Yeah.
time, actually.
To the point of introducing great art, as it were, into regular homes, certainly in England, the art union societies would commission Minton to produce these Parian figures of great works of art, imitations of great works of art, which could be acquired by lottery, relatively cheaply, and the winner would get this. And the idea was didactic; it was educative. To introduce art, as it were, into and thus to educate and to civilize. So I think it was part of the larger aim, obviously always linked with commerce and so forth. Yeah. A question, yes.
I think it's worth going back to talking about the influence, the mutual influence of collectors and museums and collectors and the rise of Majolica, because I think there was a parallel in the United States in what we went through, and I think it's worth, and maybe Joan could talk a little bit about this, how Majolica was rediscovered here, and how Joan Graham and Marilyn Carlson wrote and did an enormous amount of research about 30 years ago, I think.
89.
25 years ago, and really wrote a seminal book about Majolica, which really talks about a lot of the things that you're talking about, although from the standpoint of these were people who were collectors. They were not museum curators, and there was a tremendous influence on the popularity of Majolica here that grew out of collectors, and I wonder also if there was then an influence back onto the scholarly field, so there was a mutual kind of back and forth in some way between the collectors and the scholars. But I think it's worth noting that it was collectors here in the 1989, not scholars, who wrote the book.
I will just make a comment. Marilyn and I, of course, started collecting because Majolica was so inexpensive and it was so exciting and fun. But there were very good collectors at the Linda Horn, the Novaks, the Hoffmans, and there was someone else. We were little novices in the game when we started compared to what Linda was doing. But we knew nothing, and there were no books written. There was absolutely nothing. And we were fortunate enough to have a connection with Harry Abrams. and he gave us a letter of introduction. We have 2 novices, but devoted collectors, and could you accommodate them? And the V&A accommodated us, every place we went accommodated us, and out of that grew a book, and Michael Strasser, who was an auctioneer and collected spittoons, created what he called a collectors club, and we had our first meeting in 1989, coincidentally, and we said, well, we can't call it a collectors club, it has no pizzazz, so we named it the Majolica International Society, because Robert Layer, who wrote the French chapter of our book, came with us, and all of a sudden a whole industry came up. And I was going to say this later, we had the audacity to write a book that we called Majolica, A Complete History, an Illustrated Survey. And Harry Abrams did that, and Bard has now given us a world view. That is what I have to say about collectors collecting and educational museums.
And then Cooper Hewitt came in.
I forgot about that. At the same time, the Cooper Hewitt, David McFadden, who had a passion for Majolica, decided that they would do an exhibit, and they put out a flyer to the Wedgwood Society that said, if anybody knows of Majolica collectors, please send pictures. And that's how we found out about it. So we sent them pictures, and they chose 18 pieces.
What year was that, do you remember?
About the same time as, it all happened at the same time. Because I remember we had the cover of the book, and Paul Atterbury visited, and he was very excited. So it was David McFadden in New York City that brought Majolica into view. And I mean, one of the pieces in the entrance was, and welcome, some of the people will be in my house tomorrow, I carried off a field in Brimfield, the biggest flea market, and it was right in the front of the exhibit. But so we are all people with a passion, and the educators and the collectors really have to work, and the auction galleries. I mean, all of us are in a position now to educate the world on our passion.
Well, I think thus our historical field's born. I think you've illustrated that very, very nicely. I mean, I think, and I think if you look back to the 19th century too, you'll see much of the same impulses coming from collectors who then publish, like Soulage and so forth, publish their collections of Henri Drouin and so forth. They are then copied and become a field, publicized field that can then be studied as it were.
I want to say one more thing that the Majolica Society is now doing through Deb English. She is creating an archive electronically that all of us will be able to do research from. She is attacking everyone who possibly has a photograph of any kind of Majolica, whatever country, and illustrating who it's from, the date it was made. I mean, the research that Deb is doing is phenomenal. So. We're all participating.
Wonderful, yes. I would say it goes the other way too. Often a scholar will research something completely unknown and publish a PhD in a book and so forth, and it will open up a field,
that's right,
which then becomes collectible and so forth. So it's two-way, but clearly it's a wonderful, we're in the middle of this process right now, I think. Any other questions?
In your acquisition, you mentioned initially in your museum that you just purchased a group of Majolica. Can you describe what you had to go through to convince someone that having none in your museum, that they should consider an acquisition?
Well, I must say that I was very lucky that this time in this particular case because it was an opportunity. There was an auction of a whole collection of this kind of Ginori production. That was extremely cheap. Really, the prices were amazingly cheap, and the owner of the factory at the time, 2011, now we have a different ownership, happened to be fond of that particular kind of ceramics. He had 2 pieces in his own collection. He had acquired 2 pieces at a much higher prices. So when I told him, yeah, there is this collection. The prices are so good. It was not difficult to convince him. It was really good luck for me. It was not my. I have no merit in this.
Naturally, Rebecca, have you experienced any resistance among colleagues in your more historical display now? You were saying that you have a more balanced approach to your collections and so forth.
Well, I think certainly since the 1960s, 70s onwards, and our attitude to, or particularly the fabric of the building, the architectural ceramics, and then of course the Minton exhibition that Paul Atterbury and colleagues curated, there's been a real appreciation for that material. We also, politically within the museum, we had a separate department called the Circulation Department, which was very much where the curators who were originally set up to circulate objects of interest to what was termed in the 19th century the provincial museums. So a lot of this material ended up in circulation, and actually it was the likes of Barbara Morris and her colleagues who were acquiring, for me now as a curator for 19th century material, a great deal of what in the past has been disregarded or considered the everyday or not academically worthy. Now we much more appreciate it, but it's because that department was merged into the ceramics department about 20-30 years ago that we've gained that knowledge, but also the collections as well. And today, if I just recently obviously made a proposal to my keeper for the collections. We're acquiring about 10 pieces from Judy Novak. She's been incredibly generous. It's coming through the American Friends loan to us, and I think it helps if you yourself are passionate about that material, but it wasn't difficult to convince the keeper because it is an area where we still need to add. We don't have, I mentioned we have very little Wedgwood. It's the first George Jones piece that we are acquiring for the collection. I would love a garden seat. Just a
I have 21.
but it's an area that we're developing. Yeah.
Question.
The production, the number of pieces. I think people in this room probably know the number of peacocks and the number of wine coolers and so on and so forth. And we look at, I always believe that Minton is a business. And they're out to make functional pieces to be used by a mass number of people. Then I look at your presentation on Marfra, and the question I have there is the production of those pieces. What was the intended audience besides royalty? And was it a long production run, meaning many pieces were mass produced, or were they individual pieces?
I think that Mafra was a very extraordinary man because he worked very much, and he worked in a manufacture with about 10 and 50 men, but he exported for all the world because his works are exported to United States, to England, to France, He was a really commercial man.
Okay.
And of course he has the nobility that acquired the pieces for.
Thank you.
To that point, actually, did Ginori produce more everyday stuff, or what you should?
Yes, absolutely.
They did, yeah.
Ginori was at the time an industry. It was founded in 18th century and always had more everyday use production and high-end production to both things. In the 19th century, especially from 1861 onwards, it really turned into an industry. So there was serial production in large quantities of porcelain, industrial porcelain, that was essential to support the artistic production, because the artistic production was not sustainable economically. They had to produce the industrial ware in order to be able to make also the artistic ware, which in turn gave a good reputation to the factory, and so helped to sell the industrial ware. So it was a mutual support. But the artistic production was in limited numbers. It was not. Some pieces were unique pieces for the exhibitions, of course, but there was also the artistic production was meant to be in more than one piece, even if maybe not many, but limited production, because they were entirely hand painted and so.
There's a lady there? Yes.
Is there a ceramic stove tradition in the middle of Majolica or Majolica history?
Not from a British perspective, apart from the stove I showed you at the Great Exhibition, which was really to showcase Hardman's construction and Pugin's design, but Sweden there is.
Central Europe,
Yeah.
there's a great tradition of heating by stove, and every great house has an amazing stove, many of them Majolica, in every room.
Yeah.
The Alpine.
Ginori produced stoves as well, but they were not, to my knowledge, because very few survived, made in Majolica. They were not glazed. They were more like terracotta stoves. But there was.
What was the period?
The 19th century. 19th century.
Yeah, I had a question about technique. So for Minton, we're talking about the lead glaze, we were talking about it yesterday. And then for the Italian wares, Ava, you were talking about tin glaze. Did they ever use a lead glaze? And do you know if they copied glazes from the UK or from France or?
No. They usually it was only tin glaze. Yes. It might be that the Lucchesi production, the figures that I showed you towards the end of my talk, might be tin glaze with a lead glaze on it. It might be, because they used to do that as well to give it a more glossy appearance. But we've never had the chance to analyze it, so we not really. I don't know. Really, might be.
I think we have time for one more question. At the back. Paul, yeah.
This is a question for Rebecca, really. You were discussing Henry Cole's close association with Minton, and yet Cole is traditionally associated with the reform position, which Andrew outlined last night, one might have expected to be quite hostile to many aspects of Majolica. And Andrew quoted one of Owen Jones' famous statements on this. And I wondered if you would clarify that point between Cole and Minton and the taste for Majolica.
Well, I think, as Andrew explored last night, Minton were producing a huge range of materials throughout the 19th century. And although Cole and Minton had a very close relationship and they had a particular interest in what we now consider design reform or good design, examples of showcasing historical sources, offering options to the public, I think was the key thing for Herbert Minton. At the end of the day, he was a businessman, and he was producing the different lines that you outlined. The top end production, the historical references. They're still producing throughout the whole of the 19th century, everyday cups and saucers, and there's still a demand for floral decorated bone china at the end of the 19th century as there is at the start of the 19th century. So I think again, it comes down to personal taste of Herbert Minton and Cole, particularly with Majolica. I think the pieces that we've seen, although to a modern eye, seem to go against design reform. When you actually look at them and examine them, the wine cooler, the Victoria wine cooler, is an example of the function and form. It may not be everyone's taste today, but certainly at the time, it was considered very much part of the decorum. So I think that's something we have to be aware of, all the different styles that were being produced. I mean, the 19th century is the great melting pot, the pushing forward of technology, developing the glazes. I say sometimes it's akin, in a way, to the 18th century when Sèvres are showcasing their colours, their gilding, and everything combined on one pot. The same is going with much of the production in the 19th century. So it's complicated. That's all I can say. It's complicated. Yeah.
Sorry, I have one more question that I wanted to ask Nisan and Christine, and this is on technique. But the Palissy copies, Palissy was famous for casting live snakes and frogs and so forth. Did the copyists in the 19th century do the same? Were they attentive to, did they try and replicate the actual techniques that Palissy outlined?
Well, Aviso, who is sort of the greatest in terms of that aspect of the Palissy art, knew how to mold the creatures in the way that Palissy was doing it, but he actually preferred to sculpt. And it's very interesting that he collected all these animals, again replicating Palissy's life story and doing that. So he spent a lot of time looking at them and really getting to know them, which is why he was able to create such incredibly realistic compositions. But he really favored creating individual sculptures, even though sometimes he did occasionally mold
interesting.
animals.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we should break for lunch there. Thanks again to our speakers for a wonderful morning. And